Hello again, my name is Leslie Kendall. I'm the chief historian of the Peterson Automotive Museum, and we're back at the Rudi Klein collection of automobiles that's going to be sold by R.M. Sotheby's very soon. Now, we ended our last episode with 911s, but that doesn't mean we're done with Porsche, because right in front of me here is a 356 twin grille Roadster, an incredibly rare car, a very late model car, judging from the grills, and you can tell it was the ultimate in power for the day. It says the Porsche 60 on the back, denoting its horsepower rating, its factory horsepower rating. Now we've talked a little bit more about Porsches, but in the first video we touched on a very, very prominent manufacturer of German luxury cars prior to World War II, Maybach. And there are a couple here that I'd really like to show you. Each of them has their own interpretation of the best in design for their day. But first, I want to take a look at the BMW 503, a V8 powered car, one of the earliest V8s ever made from BMW, made in two versions, a cabriolet and a coach. Now, we talked about how this BMW 503 has one of BMW's first V8 engines in it. Well, here it is, intact and in all its glory from 1957, the year it was built. You can see the double carburation, the factory air cleaners, all of the bits are intact. Very unusual for a car, and this is an especially nice example. Even the interior is virtually pristine. Well, there's something else that caught my attention that I'd like to show you now. Now, checking out the BMW, I couldn't help but notice a Ferrari V12 engine block just sitting here on a pallet. I think a lot of people don't realize how important the V12 was to Ferrari, and the fact that it was the only V12 on the world market between 1949 and about 1962 when Lamborghini came along. Now, if you want to learn more about Ferrari V12s, be sure to catch our video on Maranello masterpieces. All right, well, having talked about our BMW V8, let's talk about a couple of other pre-war German cars. Very grand cars, very imposing cars, but each with its own interpretation of the German style. Well, we talked about two approaches to German coach building. This is the early traditional classic approach with an upright grille, separate fenders, side-mounted tires. Now, these two cars are essentially sisters under the skin, because when a Maybach started to wear out, you just didn't throw the whole car away. Maybe all you needed was another body. So the owner in the day sent this to Wendler, a coach builder in Germany, that created this marvelously aerodynamic coachwork for the vehicle. No separate fenders, no side mounts, everything was flush. It was like a shell, a post-war shell over pre-war mechanical components. And all of that work was done to give it a look that was more in keeping with the 1950s. Now, looking around at the collection, you'll see that it's much more than about cars. For example, it's about parts and just about anything you want. For example, we have rear windows for Porsche Targas, we have Recaro seats, and we've got virtually anything else you can imagine. Recaro was a very important manufacturer. They made the most comfortable automobile seats and upholstery ever. This is badged Recaro because back in the day, that was a pretty important thing. Recaro is R-E for Reuter, C-A-R-O for Carrosserie. So Reuter, Carrosserie, abbreviated to Recaro. They went from coach building to making seats. Now, in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a movement by Italian manufacturers to employ American power in their cars, to give it that kind of reliability and muscle, but without necessarily the complication. And this is a perfect example of that. This is an Iso Grifo, but not just any Iso Grifo. It is a roadster, an experimental car, probably one of one. And if you want to see what the engine looks like, there it is. It's a Corvette engine, American power plant, gorgeous Italian coachwork, and it's a shame they didn't build more. something else important about this car is the manufacturer. It was built by Iso Caro, which was a refrigerator manufacturer in Italy. They're the ones that made the Iso Isetta, the very, very early bubble car, the one with the door that opened in the front. Then they segued on and they end up making Iso Leles, Iso Rivolta, and this, the marvelous Iso Grifo. Well, back inside, we've entered a room that's a little bit more parts-oriented than other places in the collection. For example, to my left, there are headlights and taillights. To my right, there are window regulators. Behind me, there's rear glass and windshields. And this isn't where it stops, because there's a lot more to show you upstairs. Now upstairs, there's even more to take in, because you have different kinds of parts. You've got hubcaps, you've got wheel covers, you have brake systems, you've got suspension systems, you've got seats, you have bumpers, you have so many other things. But what's especially interesting are the parts over here that are in their original boxes. Now, there's no way you're going to find a 1958 Mercedes in an original box, but hopefully it'll be a little bit of consolation that you could find at least a part to a 300 SL in a box. Now there's plenty of Italian cars to look at, but before we get to those, I wanted to show you one last German car, a very important car, the first production car with fuel injection. Beginning in 1954, Mercedes-Benz endowed the 300 SL with fuel injection. In 1957, they went from the gull-wing version to the roadster version, and those they made through about 1963. But even among 300 SLs, this Mercedes is interesting because of its Rudge wheels. It was a very rare option and one that's highly desirable today. Now we've already seen an entire Ferrari, although it was missing its engine. Now we're looking at about a third of a Ferrari. Now you could restore this car if you wanted or use it for parts, but it's so interesting the way time got to it, that it's rusty, the paint is faded, it's been cut up. It's almost worth leaving alone just as a work of art. Now we're lucky enough to have run across an Alfa Romeo Montreal. This is a V8 engine, Alfa, front engine car, named Montreal in honor of the Montreal Olympics at about the same time it was introduced. Now you look at a car like this and you think, well, if everything is theoretically restorable, this should be too. And it certainly is. But most people would not consider this a restorable car. They would consider it at best a parts car. It's rusty, it's dented, body panels are torn apart, and from all appearances, it looks like it's been in a fire. All of the soft trim is burned away from the framework. It's kind of an interesting study, but as a potentially restorable car, maybe not so much. Now this collection doesn't have only Ferraris, it has the granddaddy of all supercars, the Lamborghini Miura, important to the world of the automobile because it was the first super high performance vehicle to place its engine in front of the rear wheels, but behind the passenger compartment for a genuine mid-engine configuration. Now, the first thing you're going to notice about the Lamborghini Miura is the design, which was at the root of the Gandini style, a wedge shape that defined all supercars that came after. And this collection doesn't have just one Miura, it has several. And here's what they look like under the hood. As you can see from this viewpoint, the layout that made this car so different than any one that came before it was the mid-engine, rear-wheel drive layout, the same layout that made every supercar what it is today. And now I have another 1970s beauty to show you. Now we get to Maserati's most exotic car of the day. This is a Bora, which, like its sister, the Miura, was named after a wind. And underneath the cover, you can see it's got a V8 engine. And this is what separates this car from the Miura. Miura has a V6, Bora has a V8. Well, enough about Italian cars. We can leave those to the cats, who obviously enjoy them too. But I want to leave you with British motoring royalty, the Aston Martin. And this is an example of the ultimate in 1980s front-engine, rear-wheel drive sports car. Big double overhead cam V8 engine, 4 carburetors, the ultimate motoring experience in the day. Probably one of the most special things about the Aston Martin is its engine, a double overhead cam V8 with 4 carburetors. And the reason it has Lagonda on the camshaft covers is because Aston Martin and Lagonda were merged by the owner, David Brown, right after World War II. Well, all good things must come to an end, and so does our visit to the Rudi Klein collection. The last time all of these marvelous artifacts are going to be gathered in one place before the RM Sotheby's auction. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you'll visit us again at the Peterson Automotive Museum.